Welcome to the Jungle Brothers podcast. I'm your host, Joey, and today I'm chatting with Sara Gross. Sara is a former Ironman champion, the founder and chief of Feisty Media, host of the Feisty Women's podcast, and a mum. Through her work, Sara's goal is to create an empowering culture for active women. In this chat, we dive into women's performance. We talk about how much of sports and sports science has evolved at the exclusion of women and how this has impacted the culture of female performance. We also talk about the menstrual cycle and its impact on training, as well as some of the unique considerations for women when it comes to nutrition. We do try and cover the whole chat from both a coach and an individual perspective. So whether you're a woman who's wanting to improve your own training approach, or you're a coach who's looking to better understand your clients, you'll find a bunch of good stuff in this chat. Now, before we get into it, I want to take a second to talk fitness business. If you're a coach or an aspiring coach and you want to do something special in the fitness game, but you don't want to follow the standard industry mold, the Jungle Alliance might be for you. The Jungle Alliance is a coalition of world-class coaches and gyms who are elevating the standard in the fitness industry. Our aim is to foster the growth of epic small gyms and coaches that go against the grain of the typical franchises and globo gyms that dominate the fitness landscape. If this sounds like something you're interested in, we would love to connect. You can reach out to us at junglealliance.com or through the Jungle Alliance Instagram, which is simply at Jungle Alliance. Please enjoy today's chat with Sara Gross. Good morning, Sara. How are you?
Good afternoon, Joey. I am great. How are you?
Yeah, good afternoon, of course. You're coming in from Victoria, Canada.
Yeah, BC, Canada. So it's 1 p.m. here. What time is it for you?
It's 8 a.m.
Okay.
Yeah,
well, good morning to you.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, yeah, no problem. Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Could you start by telling me where we went wrong with female performance? It's obviously a huge question. It's what we want to dig into today. But where was the point where we screwed that up?
Oh, it's always been screwed up. Like we screwed up at the beginning, in terms of like sport. I studied ancient history, right? So like sport, the original Olympic Games, it was kind of designed by men for men. And that's not me being bitchy. That's like actually what happened. And so like the expectation that women are going to be fully included in sport now is like kind of unrealistic. So we do have like a lot of work to do to bring that level up. And with women's performance in particular, like we came from like, thousands of years ago where women were thrown off of women were thrown off of cliffs for even showing up to try to watch sport, to today where we have almost 50% of the folks at the Olympic Games are women. So there's been a lot of progress. But unfortunately, like a lot of the ways that we design sports science studies, for example, have come through that male lens. So essentially there's still a long way to go with figuring out how we can perform as women.
Is it the kind of thing that you see, and I heard you reference this on your podcast, which is great, by the way. Does it need to be dismantled and rebuilt, or is it the kind of thing that you can take what we have and through organizations like Feisty Media and whatnot, you can start to shift the culture?
Yeah. So I think, this is not a burn it all down situation. Right. And I think, and honestly, I'm not about burn it all down. Like, I don't think that's a great answer to anything. But like you prompted me so nicely to say, like our goal for Feisty Media is to try to create an empowering culture for active women. And so a lot of like the reason we talk about empowering culture or cultural change is because I think there's a lot of movements trying to empower women ourselves, but that puts the onus on us to do all the change, if that makes sense. Like where it's like, if we think let's kind of change the culture and create a culture that is more not just accepting, but empowering, then we'll really get there. So yeah, that's what I think the approach should be.
Yeah, I get your point there. Rather than the emphasis being on the individual to grow or develop or sort of take the lead with it, if there's a culture that can form a bit of a backbone to a movement, then it gives it kind of gives people a place to come and start that journey, I suppose.
Yeah, it's definitely a both and. So, that expression, like you can't be it if you can't see it,
Yes.
you know? A friend of mine texted me. Actually, she texted me about this, and she was like, people keep saying that, like you can't be it if you can't see it. But like, of course you can. It's just harder. Right. So, of course, there's always women who are the first to do things, or people of color, the first to step into new spaces, whatever. We have the first women in certain leadership positions or whatever. It's just harder to get there. Right. So once there's one, there tends to be a cascade after that. So we're trying to make it easier, for talented people to rise to the positions they should be in sport and in society more broadly.
So could you tell me, then there's a few parts there that I'd like to explore.
Okay.
But give me the background on the science piece, where the science around sports performance
Mm-hmm.
was essentially built off the data from men, or
Mm-hmm.
rather male test subjects, and then that was just applied. Can you talk about how that's played out?
Yeah, so I think like even in my time, like when I was in my 20s, I was doing my PhD in Scotland, and I applied to be part of a sports science study where they had asked for runners who could run 10K in a certain time. And I was an elite athlete. I don't even think they figured that any women would apply who could do the time they were asking for, right? And so then when I did, they were like, oh, like awkwardly shuffling around, going, oh, we can't have women because your hormone cycles will affect the results too much. Right. And like that was, I then learned later that that was standard across the board. Like it was felt like it was that men were like the standard normal in terms of having a flatter hormone profile, and that was a better way to study sports performance. And even at the time, I kind of thought, yeah, okay, that kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
And it wasn't like this, like 20 years ago. Right. And it wasn't until years later that I was like, wait a second. Like, like that makes no sense. Like, if we don't include women in the studies, like, how do we know how women can perform best? And how do we know how those hormone profiles affect our performance at certain times? So now we have more people asking those questions, but we have a long-standing history of the way that sports science has been done. And science, to its credit, moves slowly, right? Like, you have to do studies that have proper data, and then that study's disproven or altered a bit, and it's like this layered effect, and it takes a long time to get new information. So I think we're kind of just at the beginning with that, in terms of asking the right questions to begin with. Like, how can women get the best out of their bodies, or how can we help women perform better or get better performances? And so I think we are going to see this amazing time period in front of us where we'll see some improvement in women's sport that will blow us all away.
How does the science piece, and obviously that makes sense when we think about elite athletes and we think about how sports institutions train pro athletes and whatnot. And as we know, like say I own a gym here in Sydney, and
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the gym culture, or at least for a place like ours where there's a large emphasis on what we would say performance, but that's strength development and mobility and coordination and all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we're obviously not dealing with elite athletes, but a lot of what we do, the methodologies and the protocols and whatnot, come down from the science.
Yeah.
How has that, and so that sort of gap within the scientific process, how has that affected the culture of gyms and strength training and sports and whatnot?
I actually think it's a great question. I actually think it's the opposite. So I think that the culture that we live in has affected the studies that we've done. And so it's part and parcel, right? So I think that like I think we can make faster change by focusing on some of those cultural pieces in the things that we have an immediate effect on. So in your gym, and I know nothing about it, so I'm just like talking now, but like, I'm sure there are things that you think about that, like, how can we make certain groups of people feel more welcome here, right? And I think
Absolutely.
those little things kind of go a long way in terms of, especially in terms of the everyday athlete. Like, I think the cultural environment affects the everyday athlete more, because really, like, we know, I was a coach of Ironman athletes for a long time. Like, I know for a lot of people, that actual precision of the science and that top end performance doesn't really apply to them. Like, if they keep moving, like to do an Ironman race, if you can get someone to do 15 hours of aerobic training, swim, bike, and run in a week, they're going to go out and have an okay day at Ironman, right? So the exacting of the science isn't necessary, but I think actually making that person feel like I can do this. I feel really good about my body. I feel strong. I feel ready. That's the important part. So I think we should focus on that piece because that's where we can just quickly make change and make everyone feel welcome in our environments.
That makes sense to me. So so you see it more as being the grassroots kind of change when the shift happens there at a more human level, then it feeds back up in a sense.
Mm-hmm. And then it will also come down to, like, I think some of the stuff we're finding now about training with our cycles, like it applies to every woman, right? So sometimes that information, like the average woman athlete isn't necessarily going to track her cycle, or that might just be too much work, right? Like I was a pro athlete for many years, but now I just exercise for fun. Like I don't want to track my cycle and put all this data into training logs. And like I did that for so many years, right? But it is good to know that you're going to have a couple off days, say at the end of your luteal phase, right before you menstruate. Like there's going to be a couple days there that you feel off. Knowing that is empowering, because then I can, when I'm at like the CrossFit gym and I feel like crap, then I know why. Then I can say, okay, I'll lift a little less today, and I'll bank on my good days, kind of thing. So I think there's like some empowering piece just to some smaller pieces of information, if that makes sense.
It does. It's interesting talking about the menstrual cycle. I've coached for a long time, and I mean, my gym is, I think, 55% female or 55% women, the rest male. And it, we have a really strong culture of women who embrace their training at our gym and from all different walks. And a lot of them come in sort of looking for one thing, and then they end up becoming really into, other things that we do at the gym, handstands or, deadlifting or whatever it is. You see this journey and people shift in what their interests are, which is beautiful because it shows a change in perspective and potential, their own sort of view of their potential. Mm-hmm. And I've coached a lot of them on a one-to-one setting, and this is, all sorts of people. I've never once had a conversation around a woman's period relevant to one of my clients. And we've spoken, what it's like when you're in a coaching relationship with somebody, whether it's your coach or whether your coach is someone else. It's a very intimate relationship. You talk about a lot of things. You'll talk about relationship problems, stresses in their life, demands. And I've never once had a chat about a period.
Yeah. There's like almost a life coaching piece to coaching, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's interesting. And do you think that's because, the athletes you're working with don't want to talk about their menstrual cycle, or do you feel kind of like that's maybe somewhere you shouldn't tread?
Personally, I'm happy to go anywhere, in terms of conversation. So that said, it is a subject that I know very little on. And so I would sort of feel pretty ill-equipped to be able to give them any useful information if they did have questions around it. But what strikes me is more that it doesn't get brought up. It strikes me that because it's a thing that women go through every month, and it's different across the board. But for some of them, I know it's a very sort of disruptive experience, right? Like it changes how you feel, it changes your energy levels, all of those things. So the fact that it doesn't come up in conversation when we're looking at a process like, hey, all right, yep, you got to keep getting stronger, and here's the workouts, and here are the sets. And I'm interested why, and I want to try and say this without sounding really ignorant, but I'm interested why the women that I train don't feel more forthcoming to bring it up themselves. Obviously, it's something that I should be investigating as a coach. But being that it's something that they have to deal with, it strikes me as strange that it doesn't get brought up. Can you talk on what those limitations or barriers are?
Yeah, I think there might be a couple things. Like obviously every woman's experience is different. So I can't really speak to the individual women that you're working with. But like, I know for me, for example, the environment I came from was like elite athlete, like head down, get shit done. Doesn't matter how you feel. You go out and you train. Like that was how we did things. Right? And so that kind of idea that you were going to actually pay attention to your hormones and go, actually, today might not be a great day to do these intervals. I think even now, a lot of my peers who are still elite athletes would say, oh, hell no, I'm getting this done. Like my intervals might not be as good, but I'm going to go get it done. And I think, and they think that that's kind of like baked in sometimes to our performance mindset. The other thing, and maybe this is kind of an equal and opposite, is that I think sometimes we've internalized as women this idea that our hormone cycles make us weak, and like we talk about, even you and I in this conversation, like we're trying to have a good conversation about this, but it's hard not to talk about like off days. Like I said it myself, like I would have a couple off days, right? At the end of my luteal phase, etc. Right? Like we need to reframe how we have that conversation too, like to not think that like our hormone cycles are actually a weakness, but that actually it's a strength, so that we can like are there things we can do? For example, can I not feel off on those 2 days by doing certain things with nutrition, or by creating my training in a different, instead of doing like 3 days hard, 1 day easy, or however we do our training programs, like, can we write the training program better so that I can get stronger on the right days? There's lots of things we can do that are like positive manipulations of how we do the training and nutrition. And I'm not a scientist, so I don't know exactly what those things are, but I'm guessing that for at least some of the women that you work with, they will feel like that menstrual cycle is a weakness. And they probably are like, like I would have been like that 10 years ago. I would have said, no, I don't care. I'll just get it done. And it wasn't until I had a couple raises just like where I just completely like flopped just really badly. Like I ran a marathon an hour slower than I was fit to do, where I thought, oh, actually, you know what? I should try to make sure I don't race on certain days of the month. So I think it's that. I think it's like changing, maybe shifting, starting with yourself. And I would start with myself too, like shifting your own, like what are my belief systems around the menstrual cycle? And how can I turn it into a positive to create a positive framework for that conversation?
Can you talk to me about your time you were a pro triathlete?
I was, yeah, for 14 years.
Wow. That's a long time in the game.
Yeah. It sounds long to me too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk to me about what that was like. You've mentioned that you had the sort of push through mentality and just get it done, but talk on maybe some of those hurdles that you faced, as a woman engaging in a sport like that doesn't really take into account certain cycles that you have to deal with.
Yeah. Well, triathlon in general has been like a fairly great sport to be in as a woman. I'm sorry. We like have equal prize money. We always have, we get a lot of media attention. I had opportunities with sponsors that I might not have had if I played American football or something.
You were a pro triathlete, 14 years, you said, which is a long time in the game. Mm-hmm. Could you talk to me about, and I suppose not just the menstrual cycle, but, from a nutrition perspective, from a recovery perspective, what are some of the things that you can look back now and think, wow, I really that wasn't managed in the best way that it could have been?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There's layers to it, right? So from a nutrition standpoint, for example, I can remember playing around a lot with things like actually try to improve our fat burning. So sometimes that meant like not eating carbohydrate. And we do these periods of like, say, 24 hours where we did sessions and we didn't eat carbs. We'd eat a lot of protein and fat in that time, like because we were in the middle of hard training. But to create that like glycogen deficit, that would be bigger than what you would do if you just ate carbs after and recovered properly from your sessions. And I think about that now, like without any, like we were doing all that based on studies that didn't include women at all. Right. So like there were some times when like, and I didn't know why, but like the next morning, like if I had recovered in the evening with only, say we would have like salmon and eggs, like a big omelet for dinner, that would be a typical thing that I would have on that day. The next morning I'd just have coffee and go for a long run. And I sometimes it would be amazing. Like I would feel great. And I would definitely get that like hyper response then when we ate carbs again. Of course, our muscles would like lap it up and we'd make really great adaptations. And other times that long run would just be like hell on wheels, like the worst, right? And I think about it now and I'm like, that was probably just my hormone cycle. And we didn't know. Like there were probably certain times when I shouldn't have been doing that. And we just didn't have the information. Whereas like my partner at the time, he was also a pro athlete and we were in Switzerland training. So we'd go, like the long run would be like 2-3 hours in the Swiss Alps, right? And he'd just get so annoyed with me sometimes because suddenly, like of the two of us, I was like relatively speaking better at running. So we could run together normally. And I would just sometimes that last hour, I'd be dragging my feet, barely able to run. So it's pretty clear now why. But that's a nutrition example. I have other examples like the ones I just said to you about like times when I would go to a race. Like I would do an entire race build, spend 4 months getting ready. The race would be on a certain day that just happened to hit the wrong day of my cycle. And so I wish that we had information to go, okay, like either don't race on that day or figure out what we need to do in order for me to perform on that day. The third example I have is one like more about kind of like the mental health thing is like I'm celiac and I didn't know that for like I was a pro triathlete for 8 years before I realized I was celiac. And my body used to like the way that I would gain and lose weight wasn't do you say like it didn't seem to form any pattern, like sometimes I'd be like not eating very much and then I would like gain a ton of weight or I'd look puffy, and like holding a lot of water and carbs, or I'd get super lean sometimes, like, and I wasn't even trying, and in retrospect, like, I think that potentially my coach at the time assumed that I had some kind of eating disorder. Because so many elite athletes do. And I always like, he would try to like softly, like looking back, I'm like, oh, he was trying to broach that with me. And I'd always say, well, no, like I don't. And I didn't. And then he didn't think to say like, to go, oh, maybe we should look into it. Like maybe, so then later I found out I was celiac. I'm like, oh, this all makes sense. Like suddenly everything started to make sense. But I think like there's that cultural piece too. Like there was, and it's not really his fault. Like I don't blame that coach, but he probably had a lot of experience. There's a lot of endurance athletes who struggle with eating disorders, right? That was probably his experience. And he was just like, I've seen this pattern before. This is probably what it is. So I just wish he'd gone, oh, wait, let's try to figure this out.
Yeah. Could you talk on the Feisty Media, which is your company that you founded? As I understand, I had to listen to some of your podcasts, which I mentioned I really enjoyed.
Oh, amazing. What did you listen to?
I listened to the first one where you had the panel on.
Oh, yeah.
And then the one that I was listening to yesterday morning, was you had a woman on that was talking about diet culture.
Oh, Taylor.
Yes.
Taylor Tracy. Yeah, she was great. Mm-hmm.
What I liked there was that you made the point that empowering active women is a thing. It's important, but that creating, this goes back to what you said in the intro, creating the culture for empowering women is sort of more important because it's more of a long-term sustainable sort of solution. You're creating a movement that people can be a part of rather than just going, hey, you should try and, whatever, be more confident in what you do or own it or whatever those mantras are.
Totally.
Can you talk to me about how that company works to actually do that? How do you create such a culture?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we have a quarterly meeting with we call it the all teams meeting with all like my staff. I have a lot of like part-time contractors who they might just host one podcast or something like that. So we have a meeting, the all teams meeting. And I thought I should really kind of try to unpack this, like how we are trying to create an empowering culture, because that's like, actually, like, what does that even mean? Right. And so some of the things that I came up with were like just the idea of like telling our stories, I think is really impactful. Like sometimes you suffer alone in something that you don't realize that like everyone else is feeling the same thing. So that's where the podcasts come in. And I think like, as we talked about, it's only 6% of exercise science studies from 2014 to 2020 anyway, that were done on women. Right.
Right.
So like, how do we even know what studies to do? Like the questions even for the studies are going to come out of women's experiences themselves. Right. Or even with things like product design, that's where it's like, oh, somebody has to be the first person to say like, oh, the product design's not working. Like I'm chafing in this weird way in this, in this kit or whatever it is. And other people go, oh yeah. And then we have new product design. So I think that storytelling piece can actually create like a domino effect. The other one is about like changing ourselves. Because I think like a big part of culture, we need culture. Like culture is something we can't just like remove ourselves from culture, right? Otherwise it would just be chaos. Like we have to label the world, name how things work so that we can communicate with each other and that kind of thing. But also it means that we've like internalized some of the norms of our culture or all of the norms of our culture. And so it's kind of, there's an introspective piece to it as well, saying like, okay, if I like, what are the things that I've internalized? What do I believe about female performance? Do I think women could be X, Y, and Z? How physically capable do I think women are? Like, how great do I think we could be? Like, just looking at our own internal belief systems and encouraging other people to do that too. I think that's like, that goes a long way. And then also finding our community, right? So it's like when we're finding groups, like for example, we have a Feisty Menopause podcast, right? And I didn't realize it. I knew there was a gap in information for women in menopause, but I did not realize how big that gap was until we launched this podcast. And it just went crazy. Right. And it's because like active women specifically in menopause had no one talking to them at all and like nowhere to tell their experiences. So we have the podcast, but then we also create a community, like a membership group around that too, so that women can talk to each other and share their experiences. So community is a big part of it as well. And I think a last one that I've seen in terms of changing culture is to like actually be willing to meet people where they're at. Right. So that's why I loved your question earlier about coaching women. Right. Because it's like, it's not just like I know everything and I know all the changes that need to happen. And like women have all different experiences. There's like 4 billion ways to be a woman in the world. Right. Like, I don't know. I don't have the answers. Like, I'm just going to like, to a certain extent, you have to listen and hear and understand. And that's like, so that's part of like what we do as well. Like when it's always that like calling in instead of calling out. I try to stay away from like a kind of that kind of like angry narrative, right? And instead say like, okay, like someone has a belief that's different than mine. And I want to know, like, I want to hear about it. Like, I want to meet them where they're at and potentially kind of like speak to them from there instead of like, no, you have to believe everything I believe in order to be a good person. Cause that's just dumb.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's a good way to push people away when you come in with the heavy kind of dogma, isn't it?
Yeah. Like on Facebook or Twitter or whatever, just like attacking. It's like, that's not to me, that's not a change making strategy.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I do think that, like, say the just the topic, anything related to gender is, and well, we're not actually talking about gender here. We're not, it's not like men versus women kind of thing. But I do find that anytime that conversation gets raised, it often really ignites people. Like a lot of people get triggered over it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I have the experience of like, sometimes I think because people know that I'm running Feisty Media, they see me as a feminist, and I am, and like they're kind of scared to like bring up certain conversations or whatever. So I'm always glad when I can convince them that like, no, like let's just have a conversation.
Yeah, I'm stoked you haven't torn my head off yet.
Well, I was about to. No.
Yeah. Let's see if I can slip up over the next 40 minutes.
Yeah, this is just give me your best shot,
That's really cool. The culture piece is interesting to me because my gym, and I'm not, I don't care to tell you all about it, but we have a really strong culture in our gym, and that's what we're known for. And it's known for being a really inclusive, fun, unique space. We have, really wild Christmas parties and social events, and it brings out this side of people that they find themselves being quite surprised at, like, holy shit, like, look what this place has done to me, sort of thing. And it all comes down to the culture of the gym. And so we often try to articulate amongst ourselves what it is that creates a culture. And it's not always an easy thing to put your finger on. You know, that you have your messaging, podcasting, social media, you have social events, things like that do sort of direct it. But there's also something a little bit, I don't know what the word is, but ephemeral to it, where you can't, like how do I actually define what the culture is? So it's cool to see organizations like yours that are crafting your own, and largely through the online space. I'm guessing, like you, it's mostly digital events and whatnot. Am I right in assuming so?
Yeah, that's right. We have a lot of online events like virtual summits. We do have a couple in person, like we have a Women in Triathlon Summit. We have a gravel bike festival for women coming up in April. But yeah, you're right. It's mostly online.
Could you tell me, in terms of the women that are part of Feisty Media or are in your community, do they tend to be the performance kind of triathlete, endurance athletes type thing, or do you find that you've got CrossFitters in there and weightlifters and perhaps women who are not even engaging in a training process yet and whatnot?
Yeah, it's changing. So we started, like I was a triathlete, so our Feisty Triathlon brand and our podcast called Iron Women, those were the first things that we did. So we have a lot of triathletes that are still with us everywhere. And we have a lot of cyclists too, because Celine, who runs the Feisty Menopause podcast, it's called Hit Play Not Pause. She came from cycling, she's a fitness writer. But as we've been growing and moving more into like menopause broadly as a topic and women's performance as a topic, we've attracted more. So we have some CrossFitters now. And we have,
you're a CrossFitter yourself these days.
I am. Yes. I am a very, very amateur CrossFitter, but yes. And we had at our summit last year, at our women's performance summit, we had some rowers. I was quite surprised, and we had some folks who were just active, who just did say hiking, or I shouldn't say just hiking, because hiking can get really hard sometimes, but who were who just like to move. They wouldn't necessarily identify as an athlete. Yeah. So that's part of what we talk about too. If you move, you're an athlete, kind of to help people own that identity too. Because especially women, I think sometimes tend to oh, I'm not an athlete. I just do triathlons on the side. You're you're an athlete, or I just run a 5K. Nope, you're an athlete. So that's part of how we message it too. I wanted to talk about, you said about your gym culture. That's really, I had this conversation with a friend of mine yesterday. Can something truly be actually inclusive? And what the space, 100% inclusive, and what spaces do we actually want to be inclusive and what do we not, right? Because I go to a CrossFit gym that sounds a lot like what you're describing. That's like a community, right? And I go there and I think these are my people. I love it here, and there's everyone from the beginner 60 something who's never worked out in her life, to former elite athletes like myself, or people who have gone to the CrossFit Games. And everybody just kind of, but at the same time, it's still I feel like it's my people for a reason, right? There's some spaces, or we're creating, another example is we're creating a women's space, a lot of them are women's only spaces, right? That we're creating. We're actually actively saying we only want to talk to women here in this certain community. Or when you're making a community of menopause, that's a community that has a definition.
It's exclusive.
Around it.
Yeah.
It's exclusive. We're intentionally excluding people, right? And it's understanding where you want that. So if you're if you're a menopause community, then sure, it's okay to be exclusive sometimes. Or if other things, we have some partnerships with sports federations and stuff. And I think that the folks who are in charge of a sport, broadly or in a country, they should be really concerned about inclusion, right? They should, those, people, everyone should have access to be able to do a sport. Doesn't matter where you come from, so there's certain spaces that need to be one way or another. And I think that we need to not assume that everybody needs to absolutely feel like they belong everywhere,
That's a great point. Yeah, I think as you were saying that, I was realizing we do exclude douchebags for the most part.
Right. See?
And
there you go.
Yeah, and if you kind of have douchey qualities, then it's not the space for you.
Yeah. Totally. Or another friend of mine had an experience where in a gym where she's trying to you say like she's kind of a little bit competitive in how she works out. Like she likes that thing of like putting your time on the board and like going head to head. But they were creating a non-competitive environment, right? And it was like, this is inclusive to everyone. And she actually thought, oh, well, it's not inclusive to me. Right. And that's okay. Like, so she just changed gyms. So like sometimes those things are okay to define. You know?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I do think I think that's the beauty in you have different gyms and, jiu-jitsu is a big part of my life and you can go to different jiu-jitsu academies and it's like, it can be chalk and cheese between them. And some of them are really well, same thing. If you're hyper competitive, this is a great gym for you, but maybe not this one because this one here is relaxed and you're not going to get, you're not going to tick that box. So yeah, I think that diversity is important. I suppose the inclusion piece, I suppose diversity is a better word for it when I think about it, and as long as for an organization like ours, and I'm guessing for yours too, as long as people are open and willing to sort of take on new ideas and discuss things and have a good conversation and learn, that kind of makes them fit for the community.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
Can I dive into some, and I know you said, you're not, this is not necessarily your area of expertise. The way I see it is you have a good general understanding of women's performance. And I think it's important to mention for people listening that when we're saying performance here, we're not talking about performing at that elite level. So it's really just, performance could be you go to the gym twice a week and you would like to get the most out of the 2 1-hour sessions you spend there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then maybe you got to do a bunch of work and you got to look after family, and that is in its entirety, that is performance. And you can do it well or you can do it not so well, or there's a spectrum there. So I think that's really important for because I do agree with what you said. The use of the word athlete means different things to different people. And for a lot of folks, they're like, oh no, I'm just a hobbyist, or I just do a bit of fitness here and there. But at the end of the day, if you are investing some time in your physical development, then there is an aspect of performance and you are trying to get the most out of that. And that's relevant to how you eat and how you recover and whatnot.
Yeah. We spent a lot of time actually talking about language in terms of when we started the new podcast, especially like, are we going to call it Women's Performance Podcast, which we ultimately did end up, but for the exact reasons you just said. Because it's like, we know like not everyone's going to identify with that at the beginning, but we decided instead to go with that message, like performance is for every woman kind of message, like, which was like all around our launch. We kind of really put that message out there because I think it's important for like I would want to give that to women, like to be to think that performance is for them. And also I know like as a former elite athlete who now only trains, like I exercise like 1 hour or less per day now. And I know that like how I recover from that and how I maintain my energy and what I do nutritionally for the rest of the day and how I sleep, etc., all matters to like how well I do my job. And like you said, like how much attention I have for my daughter or my partner or whoever, so it's all performance. Yeah.
So can I pick your brain on some of the specifics around this? And as mentioned, this is not necessarily your field of expertise, but being that I'm coming to this conversation at a very low level, I'm extremely happy for you to just give me a general response.
For sure.
And sort of going back to that idea of we're not even having these discussions in the gym about a woman's hormone fluctuations during a month. So really, the general stuff is almost what needs to be addressed first. Could you talk to me about periods, menstrual cycle, and how that affects training? So, you've mentioned there's obviously the high hormone phase, the low hormone phase, but what does that, and I know it's different for each person, but what does that often equal in terms of how that month might play out?
Yeah. So, okay, the first part of the month, like from the first day that you get your period through, it's about 14 to 21 days for most women. That's like, I'm now calling it like the superwoman phase, because like that's the follicular phase where you will feel strong. It's a really good time to do like high end intervals, for example, and get a really good adaptive response to lifting or interval training. And then I know a lot of women just from talking to people will have like a day or two when they're ovulating where that's completely off, like where they just don't feel right. And so if you are like the kind of person who wants to track it, you can figure out when that's coming, or you can just do like I do, is like go hard all the days that you want to, and then take it easy when you want to, and it averages out. And then in the luteal phase, like that's when your hormones start to drop. And so you generally don't feel as good, right down to like what we like used to call PMS, and is associated with that moodiness, and that's just because our hormones are doing wacky stuff like before we start menstruating again. So those would be, for me, when I was an athlete, those would be the worst days, like the 2 days right before my period. Like sometimes I didn't even know, because I didn't track. Like I didn't know. The only reason I knew my period was coming was because I was like, oh, I feel really flat. Like that's how I felt. I know that you can, like by focusing on recovery, and getting proper nutrition in after, for example, like the regular stuff, like getting in protein and carbs within 15 minutes and like having a meal within that 2-hour window after training, like the kinds of things that you'll hear any nutritionist or dietitian tell you, like you can maintain energy a lot better, and paying attention to those things. So I think, yeah, just like making sure all the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted during those times of month can really be helpful.
And so on that, the nutrition piece, you said the 15 minutes. I understand that is that the sort of window there for replenishment is different to what men would. For males, I think for males it's like 30 to 60 minutes, and that's kind of what we've always peddled in the fitness industry. Can you talk on that for me?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because like I always use 15 minutes because like I was trying to, I was sometimes doing 3 sessions a day. So I was just trying to get to the next session in one piece, like give me some carbs as quick as possible, So I always try to eat right away or have like a sports drink with me. But yeah, I think I'm not, again, like I'm not an expert on that stuff, but I do think that like women need to pay more attention. Also, like as women age, like from age 30, we start to lose muscle mass. We know that. So, and it gets worse after 50. And so like that, our protein needs just start to go way up, and especially recovering. Right. And then also like our need, this is another one. Oh, you asked me before about things I wish I'd known in my career. Like I wish I had done more strength training, right? Like I'm like not a natural strength athlete. I do CrossFit now. I can attest to that for sure. But I was like a cardio, almost like a machine, So I was like constantly just using my cardio when my muscles would like, I would like gear down on my bike and spin fast as I can up a hill, right? Like somebody should have got, hey, maybe you should do more squats. Like, and now I'm like stronger. I'm like 46 years old. I'm stronger than I've ever been, which is weird because I was an elite athlete for 14 years, right? So like that, like I think we need to recognize that like women actually do need to lift, like probably even metabolically, even more than men do. In terms of like maintaining our muscle mass and staying strong and feeling good, again, for that performance for every woman piece, right? Like it's not about looking a certain way, it's about feeling good.
Absolutely. The post-training thing, do you tend to do that, and this is just how you do it, do you, even these days post CrossFit, do you do that with liquid? Like, is it liquid protein and carbohydrate, like a shake and a bit of, whatever, banana or something? Or like, how do you get that nutrition in?
Yeah, sometimes I do. Like I have a protein drink called Rumble. That's a Canadian company that I work with here. So like I'll often have, I have it here.
Oh.
I'll often have like one of them
just
with me.
Good.
It's easy because it's pre-made. Yeah. This is like my working busy mom dream, like shaking up like a protein drink. That's too much for me. Like I'm not getting out the Vitamix. Like yeah. So, or sometimes like, I do silly things, but I have like, I sometimes get like blood sugar issues. So I just like carry candy with me and make sure that like I have like, I could have a little bit of candy before I can get like my proper breakfast in. So I do like little bits of what I used to do as an elite athlete to make sure that my energy is stable. So I think if I'm talking to someone, if someone's looking for advice and they maybe work out a couple hours a day, but then they go to a job, especially if they work out in the morning, like I'm always like, yes, have a protein drink after, like in a very short window. Cause not because you're trying to recover for another session. You kind of are, but because you're just trying to maintain your energy. Like you don't want to hit nap time at 2 p.m., right?
Yeah. Could you talk on what those, talk to me about like carbohydrates and these nutrition differences between men and women? And I guess something to frame this off for, to give you an idea of the culture here, which I'm guessing is very much the same as there in Western Canada. But a lot of the fitness culture here was very strongly influenced by paleo, and I've heard you talk about this on your podcast. Obviously, keto is a big thing now. Intermittent fasting, there's all these different things, and they're all whatever. They have their benefits and their drawbacks. But one of the major drawbacks that I see is that they've influenced people on the whole to eat less carbohydrates. So they've sort of made carbohydrates evil. And as I understand, men can get away with it a little bit easier with having less carbs, whereas at certain times women cannot, or they pay a higher price. Could you talk on that piece?
Yeah, that's certainly been true to my experience. That anyone I know who's done keto, paleo, or tried to do intermittent fasting while training for something or doing exercise has not gone well for women. Yeah, I like it's hard because like there's some science now. Like I know there's a couple studies about intermittent fasting related to women showing that it doesn't work as well. There's a couple showing that there's at least another one study showing that may not be true. But one thing like to keep in mind for everyone is that the exercise is like creating an extra load, like being fasted. Right. So if you're fasting fasting works really, really well for people who don't move at all. Right. Because like your body uses carbs in your muscles and your brain doesn't need that much to function. Right. So if you're a sedentary person, of course you're going to lose weight if you stop eating carbs because you didn't have anywhere to put those carbs in the first place because you're sedentary. So like that was just storing. Right. If you're an active person, you need to have carbs to fuel your muscles, right? So it's like getting that balance straight. I think that I think it's individual, right? So when we don't have the real information we don't have like enough scientific information for women to know. So I think it's that like listening to your body piece that's really important. So even for men, like I talked to actually a friend of mine who does jujitsu. He calls me up and he's like, I'm feeling like crap in all of my sessions. I can't lift. I'm like, what are you eating? I know he just eats steak for dinner and nothing else, basically. He's on the steak diet. And I was like, dude, I'm like, I don't know if you're going to hear this, but like, just have like half a yam with your steak. Like just try a little bit of I could see like he was kind of suffering from LEA, like low energy availability.
Right.
And and I knew it because I've just seen so many women like suffering from that too. I think as women also, we've internalized this idea around like eating less calories just in general. So we're like always trying to be like small, like culturally, it's like this like weight loss culture is just run rampant, for so many years that and like anything to help us eat less, like somehow that's good. I don't know. I think it's dumb, but you can see how like it layers on to like if you're trying to eat as few calories as possible, and then you stop eating carbs, and then you layer on intermittent fasting, someone can end up in a calorie deficit pretty quickly.
I see because I agree with you that listening to what your body wants is an important part of it. But from personal experience, I find that it's often hard to hear what the body wants.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a kind of person, I don't need to eat a lot. I don't have a huge appetite generally. And because I really like working and I get quite caught up in what I'm doing and focused, it's very easy for me just to sort of power through and not eat. You layer on top of that, I'm probably a little bit over caffeinated, like a lot of us are. And, that kind of masks appetite to an extent. And then you've got the sort of the cortisol release when of intense training, like say after jiu-jitsu. Most people aren't hungry after jiu-jitsu because you're in such a sympathetic nervous state that your body's still so jacked up that it's really easy to just think, oh, I'm not that hungry. And chronically what that can become over time is that you're just grossly under eating. So I know for me, anytime I actually look at it and I try and track my calories and whatnot, it always is this glaring thing telling me, dude, you need to eat more food.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I see that for some of those changes, and I guess I'm talking, in context here about women, that sometimes I feel like you need to not force, but you kind of need to make yourself do those things for a little while. Like, hey,
Yeah.
eat more food, eat carbohydrates, just do it for a couple of weeks, and then you'll find all of a sudden that your appetite has kind of recalibrated to this
Mm-hmm.
input.
Yeah, I struggle to eat in the morning, and now that I'm not training anymore, because I was used to that. I was used to like training hard in the morning, like having a little snack, training hard, and then being hungry. And now I could get up and if like just not be hungry till noon, right? So I had to train myself a little bit to eat in the morning. Otherwise, I'd end up. But I definitely had a. There was a reason why I wanted to train myself to eat in the morning was because I like later had challenges like energy challenges mid-afternoon or especially in the evening, right, where I wanted to be able to keep keep working in the evening or do something with my kid or just not just flake out and watch Netflix, right, or make sure the house is clean or whatever, right. So I think, I don't know, I'd be curious, like for you, like you said, you like judge yourself as not eating enough, but did you ever have any other effects or anything else, like did you notice?
Well, interestingly, I've spoken about this before, but I was overtraining and undereating, and as a result, I was really muscular and extremely lean. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, I looked great. I was also in my mid to late 20s, so I could get away with just, sort of not having all of these things aligned.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of what we want from training, it's often like, well, that's what I want. I want to look, particularly for a guy, I want to look muscular. I want to have a six pack. I want to, and so I had all
Mm-hmm.
that. But then I look back and I realized, man, but I was also fucking tired all the time,
Mm.
and I didn't sleep enough. And you know what? Maybe if I had have just eaten a bit more, and maybe my six pack wouldn't have been quite as visible, but I would have performed better and gotten more from my strength training and generally had a happier disposition towards life. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so and it's kind of that paradox of like, well, okay, yeah, maybe you looked a certain way, but you weren't actually living the way you wanted to.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure it's true that you wouldn't have had that six pack. Like, because
Potentially.
I think, like, if you felt better during training, you might just do that little bit more, and then you're burning those carbs anyway, or you're going a little bit more intensely because carbs help us with high end stuff, right? So it's like you might have found that it did balance out for you, that that you looked the same.
Yeah, it's a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
But so I guess, having experienced that, and, when I talk about it, it's not like it was a traumatic experience. It was awesome. I looked great. I was training really hard. I had a great time. But I see other people in the gym setting, and women, men, and I see them going through a similar thing. And it's,
Mm-hmm.
and I think about, I generally consider myself not to be hyper influenced by fitness culture or whatever, even though I am to an extent. It's hard, it's impossible not to be. But I see people who I think are probably influenced more. And then I think, well, fuck, is that person under eating? Do they need to be getting more food in? I know that with quite a few women that I've worked with in the past and given them some sort of guidance on their nutrition. I'm not a nutritionist, so it's just sort of general sort of advice.
Mm-hmm.
But the main thing I've encountered is that they were all under eating, and the the really confusing part was that they were often carrying more body fat than they wanted to, but they were
Mm-hmm.
under eating, and so we got them to eat more food, and then all of a sudden they started to lose body fat and feel better. And
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Like the whole calories in, calories out situation, like just doesn't play out, especially for women with our hormones, right? So it's like you have to feel like you have to be fueling your metabolism properly in order for it to work, right?
and so what is that? Is that a case of you are the lower calorie thing is generally you're not getting the nutrition that you need?
I think so. Again, like I don't know really. I just know from experience, from myself, and from seeing lots of female elite athletes. Like if you like, we train better in a fed state, right? Like that's like everyone knows what it feels like. I think to have eaten properly, be properly fueled, and then go do a workout, and you can get that extra, like sometimes even like 10 or 20% out of yourself, right? Like versus, and if you just like repeat that, like it's going to go better, right? I don't know, like I do know that I don't know what it is specifically about our hormones. You'd have to go to Dr. Stacey Sims' book for to try to find that. I'm sure it's in there, but like
I started that. It's a thick book. As in, it's thick in information.
Yeah, totally. So Celine, who actually took Stacey Science and wrote that book for, she's actually the host of our Hit Play Not Pause menopause podcast,
Okay.
and she's really, really good at taking if you think it's thick and dense, like taking actually Stacey's science and turning it into something that's like readable for the average human like you and I.
Yeah, right on. On that, just because I think Stacey Sims is pretty well known, at least, most of the fitness kind of enthusiast women I've spoken to know of her book and know of her. How do you two work together? What's your relationship with what she does?
So we work very closely together. Actually, she came 5 years ago to one of our first summits. We have a summit called the Outspoken Women in Triathlon Summit. And we asked her to come speak. And I had heard of her because some of my friends were working with her, like female pro athlete friends. And she was kind of known in our circles, but like the world didn't know her. And when she came to the summit, we were like trying to tag her on social media when she was saying all these great things on stage. And we realized like she had this Instagram page with like 400 followers. She hadn't posted in 2 years. And it was like, and her last post was like, I always laugh about this. At her last post was like a picture of a United Airlines baggage carousel and her complaining about how the baggage hadn't come out fast enough. And I was like, what? Like, so my business partner, Ashley, said to me, like, I think we should pitch Stacey on doing her social media for her. Right. Like she's like, let's do this. Like, I think we could. So we did. And we started doing her Instagram page and her Facebook. And then a year in, you were like, I think this can be like a movement, and so we just worked closely with Stacey to try to get the information that she had out to, like through her courses. And so she made the courses, of course, to get those out to the world. So now you can take like the Women Are Not Small Men course and the Menopause for Athletes course that she does, which is like really dense with like scientific information. So she is like, I don't know. I think it was this like amazing serendipitous thing where it's not that many times you meet someone in your life that you're like, your message is so great that I'm like personally want to take it to the world.
That is cool. Yeah, it's funny to think that there's a huge portion of people that just don't exist on social media, of course. But when you realize that, wow, that person, they've got all this great stuff and they're not even sharing it through Instagram.
Yeah, it was like it was like weird. It was like hard to even tag her. Cause like, is this her? Everybody kept asking, like, where's Stacey on social? Like, we had her on our Iron Women podcast. Like, I don't know, it was at least 5 years ago as well. And that it was like around when like not Stacey wasn't on, now she does, 40 podcasts a year or whatever, but then she didn't. And so, that podcast just went like, our numbers were like quadrupled to what, to our other podcast numbers, because people were just like, holy crap, like all this information they didn't know.
How cool.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk to me about some of the recovery considerations relevant to female performance? So, we sort of touched on a bit of the nutritional piece. We sort of touched on like the menstrual cycle, but are there different, and this can be from personal experience or what you've noticed with the women around you, are there different considerations when it comes to recovery? So the other aspect, sleep, down regulation, those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think it's hard to know what's about being female and what's about like just, it's like hard because we don't have the information, like the studies like actually barely exist anyway. So we don't know. But I don't know. I think for me, like I noticed that I needed a lot of like downtime between sessions. So I was like an eat, sleep, train kind of person. And I noticed that some of my male counterparts would have more consistent energy just automatically. And I had to really focus to have that consistent energy through the day. Like when I started my pro career, I was working on my PhD in Scotland, and I needed to be able to have my use of my brain during the day. And so I had to make sure like I had the right nutrition in to like, and I feel like some of the guys around me were getting away with more than I was. It's hard to know. I think there's a lot of like social factors too, like for like we talked about like performances for every woman. So there's like, we know that women still take on like the bulk of like childcare or like work in the home, that kind of stuff. And so I think it's like there's a mental piece for sure that I know that like just like letting some of that go, or being able to ask for help, or saying to your partner, hey, no, we're 50-50 in this, like let's divide up the tasks in the house. So I think a lot of those social things too, just like acknowledging like where that internalized expectation comes from and how it affects like how much energy we have at certain times and how we recover.
Could you speak on looking at gym culture as you see it, and maybe this plays out at the CrossFit gym you train at, or, more sort of observations of other gyms that are perhaps less progressive? That, most CrossFit or small independent gyms are doing a pretty good job when you compare it to the greater fitness industry, I would say. Could you speak on what some of the mistakes are that you see, for women who are going and engaging in the training process? Some of the places where they go wrong, or not where they go wrong, but where things could be done better?
Yeah, I think I did on the podcast. I did an interview a couple of weeks ago with Christy Moan, and she owns a massive gravel race here in the US, not here in the US because I'm Canadian, but here in North America.
Is gravel? Is that like a downhill mountain biking thing, or?
Oh yeah. So gravel's just like massive. So it's like essentially like riding on gravel roads. So you're on like kind of like a cross bike almost.
Right.
Like it's a hybrid between like a mountain bike and a road bike. And you ride on like a lot of the dirt roads, sometimes like single track, but it's just not as technical as mountain biking.
Okay.
So gravel riding, yeah, it's really cool. And it's like right now it's like having a revolutionary moment in North America because the cyclists were annoyed. Sorry, we're on a tangent now, but like cyclists were annoyed with the riding on the road. A lot of people were being hit. The roads are more busy. Like if you're a cyclist, a friend who's either been injured or killed on the road. And so gravel just provides an alternative to that. And a lot of people just took to it right away. And what she said about being inclusive for women, I think is like something we could all learn from as women, and as anyone who like owns a gym or a race, whatever, that like, it's not just about saying, okay, like anyone can sign up. Because if you own a gym, you can say like, any woman can come to my gym, right? Or anybody can come to my gym. But that sometimes we actually need to help certain people, like invite people. Okay, so it's a 200-mile race. So what she did was she opened up 200 slots just for women. And what that meant, like with some of these races, you have to be online at a certain time even to get in, right? But so for women, that might mean they, like if they're doing childcare or they have like just like slightly busier, like they're not sitting at a desk in an office necessarily to sign up for the race. Like it meant that like a lot of men were getting those slots. And when she saved spots for the women actually signed up. So it's like the first thing that she did was just like, it's just like a little tweaking. She also created some content on her site around like, as a woman, like how you pee at the side of the road, because the races are unsupported. So there's not like, so it was like how you take your bib shorts off so that you can like squat without being seen, like this kind of thing. And just like helping people like getting good information. And I think that is like, that was like an extra, I just felt like that was really, really good advice for anyone who wants to create that. It's like if you have a space where any group has been historically excluded, like you might need to do some kind of special invite or give them information because they don't automatically see themselves as belonging there. Right. And then, yeah, I think in terms of, I think you were kind of asking too, like, what I would say to women too. Like, I think I would say, I don't know, like, just like own your shit. It's like what I want to say to like, it's like, like we're better at it, like for the gravel riding, for example, like we're better at endurance sport, right? Or like one of the women who's speaking at our women's performance summit is she won outright the Trans Am bike race, like against she was the first woman to win overall, right? So like a lot of that endurance stuff, like we can do really well. But I think it's just like that kind of allowing that like your confidence to come through, like that you do belong somewhere.
That's cool. Could you give any sort of practical advice for coaches? So, people like myself who are working with women, as I mentioned at the start, I've never had a conversation around a woman's period, even though it is like glaringly obvious that it's an important thing to discuss if we're talking about a training process.
Mm-hmm.
What are some ways that you can open up communication about that thing? There's obviously a lot that goes into it.
Yeah, I would ask if they're okay. If it's okay to open that conversation first. That's where I would start instead of just saying, "Oh, hey, is it because you have your period?" Like, because not everyone wants to talk about that, like even me, like there's a coach who runs my CrossFit gym who, like, he gives me lifting tips and he coaches me to some extent, but like I'm not in that kind of relationship with him. Like I don't want to talk about my period like during CrossFit. Like I just want to get on with it. I'm here for my like leisure activity. Right. So I think, but some people do, right? And some people, like I have heard him have those conversations with people as well. So I think you can the first thing I would do is just like straight up ask, like, is it okay if I ask you about your hormone cycle? And they might say, no, I don't really want to talk about that. And that's okay. So just to not be afraid to or to normalize that conversation. Like it's okay to talk about that stuff. We see it in a lot of our women's groups online now. Like 10 years ago, you'd never hear people talking about I don't know, things like comfort in their saddle. We at the CrossFit, like the CrossFit examples are like, having bladder issues, like
double unders.
Yeah, like we laugh about that. We're like, oh, the mum pee, haha. Like we just like it. Like when you normalize that conversation, it becomes normal. So I think just or watching for that opportunity to make that's one thing I've seen some coaches do really well is like not mention anything, but as soon as like I let on or someone like lets in that they might be interested in having that conversation, either about hormones or about ways that like how postpartum would affect women, then to take that as an opportunity, like, oh, do you want to talk about that? Let's talk about that.
Are you able to speak on this is actually a question from my partner. If there's, are the considerations different for perimenopausal women versus, and I don't actually, I understand that is a period before menopause. But do things change? So if you're looking at a female athlete who's, gone from training in a certain way up until their 30s, whatever, and then they enter a stage, perhaps, I'm not sure where the age range is for perimenopause, but do things change, or is it largely similar kind of rules, but just the individual experience is going to be different?
Yeah. Yes, things absolutely do change. So in terms of definitions, like menopause is the moment when you haven't had a period for 1 year. Okay. So like menopause happens in a day, right? And perimenopause is all the fluctuating hormones, hot flashes, all the crap that's happening in the on average, it's 7 years before that, but it's generally like 5 to 7 years leading up to that, right? So the average age of menopause, at least in North America, is 52. So you go 7 years before that. That's like a 45-year-old woman, right? Who may or may not recognize that that's what's happening. And the conversation around menopause is improving, but it's not, there's a lot of things about that aren't just like common knowledge about menopause, right? So I think some of the things, like I'm in perimenopause a little bit right now. So some of the things that I notice are that it's not like the days that I have off days or good days are it went from understanding that there was going to be a couple days before my period that would be off to a completely random. I might have 8 days in a row where I feel like crap. And then I'll have another good phase. So it's not necessarily predictable. right? Because your hormones are changing at different rates, or I might have like a totally normal month. I've had a series of totally normal months in a row here where I have like I feel off at the times of month that I expected to feel off given my entire athletic history and my history of being a woman. But like yeah. So, but before that, I had like some really random symptoms. The other thing is like definitely like lifting heavy shit. That's Stacey's phrase, but definitely women as we age, we need to lift heavy, and we're gonna respond better to like heavy training and like hits training, like the kinds of stuff that we do at CrossFit anyway, and also like plyometrics. That's why like I love CrossFit because it just checks all the boxes with that.
Yeah.
And that you can like maintain and increase your fitness off of that alone. And like we actually recommend women in perimenopause who, if you're not doing an endurance event, like you don't even really need those long cardio workouts for anything unless you absolutely love them or are training for an event where that's needed. But like a lot of your training in terms of the things you're going to adapt to is going to come from like that higher intensity, shorter stuff, hits training, like I said, and lifting. So yeah, I think it's really important that I think all women in around that age should definitely be lifting and definitely doing some high intensity training.
Yeah, that's cool.
Mhm.
I, I agree, and I think that you make a good point. The sort of long endurancey type training doesn't really have any huge benefit unless it's something that you like or unless it's specific to your sport. But if you're
Mhm.
looking just to get the best out of your body and the best out of your joints and performance, strength training and intervals are really where it's at.
Totally. And that's really great news for those of us who love CrossFit or who run CrossFit gyms.
Yes.
Mhm.
Um, Talk to me about and I'm aware of your time, so I'm not going to keep it for too much longer. I know you've got plenty to get through this afternoon. But with when you have an event that's coming up, and so when I think about, it, I look at the members of our gym. We have it might be like an obstacle race kind of thing, like a mud run, or it could be a jiu-jitsu tournament.
Mhm.
Obviously, for a woman, can't choose how your cycle is. When that thing's going to happen or how it's going to happen. How do you approach that? So let's say that the time when you typically feel at your worst just happens to be on the same day you need to compete.
Mhm.
What are some of the things that you can do there to try and mitigate the down the negative effects?
Mhm. I definitely have all my recovery taken care of, for sure. I also like what I used to do, honestly, is use like birth control to like some kind of birth control to control so I knew when my cycle was. So a lot of the elite athletes I know have like low dose hormone IUDs or copper IUDs, which means that like you know that your cycle is going to come on like 28 days, right? Also, an IUD, like I'm not a medical professional, but like an IUD for everyone that I've talked to, like reduces those symptoms too. So that's what a lot of us actually did in practice if we wanted to. Um, at times when I haven't been on birth control, I just didn't plan races for those days. Like so you track your cycle, you know when it's coming, and you just say, like that you're not doing it, you pick a different competition basically. So that's what like I would go back if I'm when I was competing, like go back from like months out and make sure that everything's lined up, like you actually so that you're like actually not having that moment in your cycle on the wrong day, and you can control that. And I sometimes used to even, I mean, I wouldn't recommend this, but I would sometimes like use, like I'd have a couple packets of like birth control pills. So I'd like knock my cycle off and restart it.
Oh
So
wow.
but that's just like, yeah, that's stuff that like, this is not me recommending
Of
that, but
course.
like we used to do like, this was my job. Right. So I would like, I would try to have that effects as like I could, because the Ironman World Championships, like that's on a certain day, right? Like, I can't,
And you
they're not
don't
going to work around my cycle.
and you don't want to miss that one.
Yeah, exactly. So like sometimes that's what I would take like something like an extreme measure, which is like trying to actually change when my cycle is going to come.
Is that something that would that be quite common practice in, say, the Olympics?
I would guess that people are doing stuff like that. that certainly the Olympians that I know, like in triathlon, would definitely have thought through their cycles. We also know, like we know that the birth control pill is not generally like not great. Like I reacted really badly to the birth control pill and had it created like a down regulation of my mood too. So like I don't love the birth control pill. I know Stacey's done some studies that show that it can affect your performance by as much as 11%. So it's important to like keep that kind of thing in mind too, like how that like how different forms of oral contraceptions or how contraceptives affect an individual woman is like different depending on the woman. But yeah, generally like an IUD, low dose hormone IUD is what I know a lot of elite athletes are using.
Okay. Sara Gross, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I appreciate you making the time. I know you're a busy person. Sounds like you have about 15 podcasts of your own, by the way.
Only 2.
Okay. You mentioned so many in there. Could you give a little plug to where people can find your podcast, find your work, if they want to know more about it, join the community?
Sure. So my podcast, the new one is called the Women's Performance Podcast. And a lot of that is the stuff that we're talking about, where I'm bringing in vetted experts to answer a lot of the questions that I can't around women's performance. We also have our Women's Performance Summit, which is at the end of March. It's the 25th to 27th of March, and it's virtual. And you can, if you buy the summit, the all access pass, you have access to that for like, even as we have a lot of male coaches who actually buy that all access pass too, or who come to the summit, who work with women who want that information. So we have like 20 vetted experts coming and speaking at that summit, including Stacey. So that's March 25th to 27th. The best place for that is womensperformance.com. So you can find summit, the podcast and everything. And then our media company is called Feisty Media, and the website's livefeisty.com.
Awesome. So cool. There's so much going on there. I appreciate you making the time. I know I asked you some curly questions, but I think that there will be some people, women, who will be able to take a lot away from what we spoke about. And even if it's just to increase awareness around, oh, hey, this is the thing. And you know what, for a woman or for a coach where it's like, I hadn't really thought about this kind of stuff. I think that is the most important thing that I would like to kind of spark from it. So thank you for coming and having this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Joey. It's been fun.
Absolutely. I'll put a link to your podcast and to the summit and whatnot in the show notes. So for anyone that's listening, you can check it out there. Get on board, follow Sara's stuff, and keep spreading the word. Thank you. And maybe we'll chat again down the track sometime.
Yeah. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Sara. Thanks for listening, guys. Hope you enjoyed that episode. Please, if it stood out to you as a goodie, share it with a friend, pass it on to someone who would like to hear it. Helps to support the show and it helps to get quality information out there. We'll catch you guys next week.